This is Thriving in Business and Life. I'm Christopher Harding.
And I'm Will Wilkinson. Welcome back to the show.
So we're following up. We've been talking about vision. We've been talking about how to generate results now. And what we're looking at next is accurately assessing the current situation.
Something that a lot of us avoid doing at all costs.
We've talked about this before, that a lot of times vision is something we can get stuck in. We can get so focused on our vision and the goal we have and the intention we've set that we maybe forget to look at what's going on right in front of us.
Yeah, we tend to present this as two sides of one coin, having a vision of where we're going and also being very clear about our starting point.
Right. So the one of the first things we talk about both in the book and the online course about assessment is just the really sometimes challenging aspect of facing facts. So when this is an area that's been kind of a specialty for you. Well, when you were, really designing that aspect of assessment, what did facing facts mean to you? What were you going after?
Well, as I recall, it was a bit of a reaction to realizing how ineffective most intention goal-setting processes were. I was really exploring why weren't they working.
Right.
Because there's a lot of hype about them. And yet when I, interviewed people who'd been using different practices, they had to admit that they hadn't really worked that well over the long term. Short term, yes. Almost, I refer to it as the cheerleading effect.
So you get some kind of initial energizing or adrenaline rush off from setting the goal, but then you go back to the same old way of doing things.
Yeah, so you get a short burst, and then things tend to decay or collapse back to the way they've always been. This shows up with lost New Year's resolutions, etc.
Right.
So I really inquired, what's wrong with the formula? Because I think for a lot of people it's a positive thinking formula. Focusing on what you want. There's a popular phrase, what you resist persists, that some people believe in. And the idea, I've even used this many years ago, that if you're working in a garden, whatever you pay attention to will grow. Now, that's true in a garden. If you water your carrots, you don't water your beets, likely the carrots will grow, the beets won't. But the problem with analogies is they're not true. They're
not across the board.
No, they're models that we can learn from. But in this case, what I arrived at was that it's vitally important to accompany every intention with a sober fact check and at least as much interest in the way things are as the way we'd like them to be.
So, as an example, in exploring this, that would mean, if I'm hearing you right, that when I'm creating a goal, I create a goal and a vision of what I want, an intention, you could say. And then I also, in that same setting, say, and so how is it right now? Exactly.
And this is especially important for entrepreneurs. Anyone who has an entrepreneurial bent can relate to the euphoria that accompanies big visions. And often that's the conversation about how great things are going to be. If somebody introduces possibilities for failure or even for slowing down on projected growth, for instance, they can be demonized as a wet blanket, a pessimist, you're not fully with the program, etc., etc. Some of that may be true, but also it could just be that they're being realistic.
Sure, identifying things that need to really be addressed in order for the vision to have the chance of really succeeding.
Exactly. So, what we advocate in our thriving work is balance. By all means, fly high, but have some wheels so that you can land as well.
Now, you've used the terminology before to live in your vision and visit the current situation.
Right.
Talk a little bit about what that means.
Well, I think it is true that where we put most of our attention is where we'll get most of our results. So having just laid out our concern for balance and looking at both sides of the coin, the vision and the facts the way they are, we would recommend putting more attention on the visionary aspect to stay excited about it and to stay focused on where we're going. One of the examples we use is driving. You have a windshield that you look through to see where you're going. You also have a rear view mirror that tells you what's behind you. As we've said, joking about it, we wouldn't be very effective driving if we stared in the rear view mirror all the time.
Well, or to the other side of that, what you're talking about, if I got overly fixated on, looking way down the road instead of paying attention to what's right in front of me, I could get myself into trouble that way too.
Right. One of the applications in society right now is relative to the epidemic of depression. And there's a lot of drugs that people can take to fight depression. But if we look at depression a different way, it's quite interesting. Depression can actually be a counterweight to the tendency to fly too high and get burned by the sun, if we remember the legend of Icarus.
Right.
So in that sense, depression becomes a friend because it balances something that's out of whack. Again, back to entrepreneurs, it's easy to burn out on a really bright vision. That would be like flying too close to the sun. Whereas the habit of addressing facts, looking at the way things are, can be depressing.
Sure, yeah.
However, rather than reaching for a drug to cure the depression and getting back to the euphoria, we could acknowledge that maybe a little depression is in order to balance things out. What a radical thought.
Well, it's interesting, and we're not suggesting that clinical depression is something that doesn't have some legitimate, physiological aspects to it, because anybody who's been through that will tell us that. But to your point, I think the aspect here that's different than how we maybe think of vision and assessment is that it's ongoing. It's not just an exercise we do when we first create a goal or a vision. It's something that we're checking into in an ongoing way. We're living in the feeling of the vision, like you said, really tapping into that goal and the intensity of our desire for that goal, while checking in regularly with how it's going. How are we? Are we on course? Are there things in the way? And so on. Well,
yes, back to our driving analogy, it wouldn't make sense to be driving and go, well, I should look in the rearview mirror every hour or so. We probably do that every few times a minute.
Sure. Yeah.
Unless we're, in a situation where we don't need to. But in most cases while driving, it's good to consult the rearview mirror regularly.
Yeah.
Likewise, when we're on our way to accomplishing anything, it's a good idea to keep checking back with the way things are as a means of navigating. We use both the vision forward and the acknowledgement of the way things are.
I was just driving on a large freeway system the other day, and that aspect of mirrors that you're talking about was really critical because, I had to be checking, it was a 6-lane freeway, so I had to be checking both side view mirrors and my rear view mirror, as well as keeping track of where I was headed. And, it was a good analogy. I could have easily, in pursuit of my goal to get somewhere, have not checked the current situation and, pulled in front of somebody or, not been aware of a situation that was around me because I was over-focused on where I was going. So I like that analogy. I think it's one that we can probably all relate to in some way.
Well, it's interesting. I'm sure listeners are kind of thinking about their lives and their habits as we talk about this. I've just discovered that I actually look in the rearview mirror a lot more often than I realized because my wife and I live in the woods. A tree fell on our van and crushed the roof, but also broke the mirror on the left side.
Oh, my gosh.
And so I'm driving in the van with no mirror.
Wow.
And because it's a van, it's tough to see through the main rearview mirror on the top.
Yeah.
And I realized that I look in that thing about every 5 or 6 seconds.
Yeah.
And I never realized that I did that so often until I don't have it at my service. So I think this is probably quite true for all of us in our lives, that we don't realize how often we are checking the way things are. Now, the caution about that is that if that's a habit, which I now believe it is, an unconscious habit, if we haven't likewise developed the habit of looking where we're going in terms of having a vision, we're going to get pulled down by the weight of the way things are and lose sight of our vision.
Well, yeah, so you've talked about this before, the balance. You're talking about a balance. We need to do both, but this is why I think you use the term live in your vision. In other words, let that be the guiding force, the compass, so to speak. And that the assessment is being aware of what you need to navigate through, around, over, under, whatever it might be. But if we get over-focused on the current situation, we could totally lose hope, you could say, or return back to a normal state of being where we're not really going to accomplish that goal because we've surrendered to what is.
Yeah, that's, I think, called giving up.
Yeah, easy way to say it.
Resignation. Yeah, and I think the point I want to make, not to beat a dead horse, as the saying goes, but the habit of consulting the way things are, and I'm not going to call it an assessment because we want to make a distinction about what we mean by assessment. The habit is just to kind of be aware of the way things are, and maybe not even consciously. We have this gnawing sense that something's wrong.
Right.
We know that something is wrong, and we cover it up sometimes with distracting substances. Let's have another martini. Or with a vision. Let's get all excited about where we're going. So I think the point we want to really impress is that if this is a habit of being burdened by our sensing of the way things are, we want to remedy that with two new strategies. One is to develop a vision and to learn how to live in the vision rather than our sense of things now. And the other is to learn how to do an assessment, which is very different than this kind of grumbling, gnawing awareness that I'm referring to.
Well, so as you're talking about that, when you say how to do an assessment, how would you describe that for somebody? What is it that they should be looking for?
Well, we make the point in our course, I think it's number 2, managing details inside a visionary context. And I think that is the key right there. It's very different to look at the way things are when we have an established vision that we're living in than to just look at the way things are.
Right.
And I don't know if we've emphasized that enough, but it makes a huge difference.
Well, so within a visionary context means that I'm looking at them in terms of what needs to be addressed in order to get to where I'm going versus, like you said, giving up. This is just the way things are.
If we face the facts of what's happening without a visionary frame for them, without a visionary context, we will tend to reprioritize according to what we see. And so what we're looking at will then become the default priority. Oh, I must attend to this. That's called mission drift in the business world.
Right.
We have to have our compass established, which, has to be orienting towards our vision, or else we'll get pulled off course. That's why that's so important.
Well, we've used this term before. Ken Blanchard, in his situational leadership course, talked about 4 categories: what's truly important, what's urgent and important, what's urgent and not important, and what's not urgent nor important. And the vision is important. It's the area where he says we should be spending 80% of our time, and another 10% on what's both urgent and important, because if we're really focusing on what's important, what becomes truly urgent is far less.
Exactly, and I think it's accurate to look at the world scene today and the political landscape, for instance, and see the addiction to the urgent.
Yeah.
Every day something else is urgent.
Well, and you think about that because, the sense of where are we going and what and how is it aligned with our values? We talked about that in an earlier one. Are my values embedded into my vision? So that if I've got both my values embedded into the vision and the vision is alive and I'm feeling it, that does become, like you said, it helps me order the priorities of my day.
Exactly. And we could look at one issue that we're probably all familiar with, and that's immigration.
Sure.
Here's an urgent problem, right? And people have different opinions about how to deal with it. But what's lacking is any kind of overview, or we call it going upstream,
right,
to study the reasons for the urgent predicament we're in. So that's missing. Why do all these people want to pour into America if we're talking as Americans? That's one issue. The other issue is, what are the values that are integral to America, written right into the Constitution, that are important to uphold? I think that has something to do with caring for each other. Those have also been lost.
Well, you look at, I heard a great conversation on this just yesterday, actually, on one of the news stations, and they were saying part of, and it was so apropos to what we're talking about, part of what we're struggling with is that we haven't accurately assessed the current situation.
Right on.
We're trying to make decisions based on the way things were 10 years ago. Yep. But the entire global geographic situation has changed so dramatically that these kinds of mass immigration and mass, refugee situations are only going to increase over time. And as this one gentleman who was, part of the Department of, Immigration Control said, the fact of the matter is we are simply not prepared to deal with the realities of our current situation. And so we're trying to deal with them in ways that maybe would have applied 20 years ago, but no longer apply today. And it was such an interesting example of how facing the facts can be so hard to do if the facts disagree with the way we wish it was.
Well, you're getting right to the heart of our topic, which is assessment. And the problem that we have as stubborn human beings, which could be encapsulated by the phrase, things have changed and I don't like it.
Right. Yeah.
Things have changed, I don't like it, and I wish they could be the way they used to be. They never will be, but I'm upset with that, and so I'm paralyzed in dealing with things right now. That kind of sums it up.
Yeah, we probably all can find areas of our life where that has occurred, and it's, as you're saying that, I was just reflecting on part of it is denial, right? That we haven't maybe accepted the way things are, and so as soon as we get into that mode, we've talked about how our brain works, so we kind of go into that amygdala hijack. I either fight it, I run from it, I freeze, or I faint. And when we're in that mode, if we don't have a vision to guide us, we can easily get stuck there in some kind of paralysis for a long time.
Well, true enough. And another fascinating aspect of all this is the denial around change. That we're on a planet that is hurtling through space. And right now we're in a part of the solar system, a part of the cosmos we've never been before, as far as I know. In other words, something has changed. Now, people who get into astrology will talk about the influence of the stars, and it's really kind of uncanny how often that has some accuracy to it. It is an ancient science. But personally, we're all changing. We're getting older. Our bodies are changing. Our minds are changing. Relationships change. And yet we tend to exist in a bubble of self-delusion, thinking that things are pretty much the way they used to be.
Right.
When they're not.
Well, going back to the astronomy, right? Just the actually looking at the science of how galaxies evolve and solar systems evolve. We know that the sun, is sitting there and the Earth is rotating around it. But what we forget is that the entire solar system is also rotating. It's moving as well.
At a tremendous rate, by the way.
Yeah, so we're flying through space. Yeah. Like you said, quite honestly, encountering territory in the galaxy and the universe as a result that we've never encountered before. We don't really know what we're going to run into.
We don't, and it's quite unsettling. I mean, personally, I've gone through a change in the last week or two. Funny, the other day, we were out of town, we got back to town, and I saw somebody who I hadn't seen in a couple of weeks. And in the course of our brief conversation, it occurred to me that they were addressing somebody who no longer existed. That I had changed in some fundamental ways. And it was quite odd to see this person who wasn't aware of that addressing somebody who was no longer there. There was no simple way for me to communicate that fact. But if we dare, the traditional term is called looking in the jade stone. If we really dare to look in ourselves, within, and make an assessment about ourselves and our experience of life, we'll notice that we're changing. We're also moving through space. We're somewhere we haven't been before. This is not generally socially acceptable. I mean, when you ask me how I'm doing, I'm expected to say, good, fine. It's our social norm. I'm not sure how many people really want to hear the gory details.
Well, in the last 2 weeks, I've become someone else.
Yeah.
But it's true for all of us, whether, like you said, whether we're aware of it, which I think creates its own unique experience, or just in general. I had, my own version of that last week. I went to Los Angeles, where I used to spend a ton of time, living part of the time and working, and was, going past these places that 20 years ago I was very involved in. Mm-hmm. And I stopped in front of one of them and just pulled over and stopped the car and sat there and realized that was a lifetime ago. That was an entirely different era, a different time. Like you said, I've in many ways become somebody entirely different since then. The focus of my life is different than it was then. And it was really quite a deep, profound realization that we don't often assess our life as we're going along and saying, well, where am I now? And how does that relate to my vision of the future? And do I have a clear enough vision of the future to which to measure this against? Because if I don't, like you said, it can totally mess up my idea of what's possible. For me, it was unsettling, not in a bad way, but in a reality check way.
Well, I think a lot of people have touched the reality of what you just spoke of, and it was sobering and disturbing. And because the support systems aren't really built into our society, it's easy to flee from that kind of raw moment and try and scurry back to the way things were. But at least in my experience and from talking to clients and friends, once we've touched something like that, like just once we become aware of something profound, we can't really forget it. We can hide from it. We can suppress it with distractions and so forth. But there's now this sense in us of something special, something unusual. I'm different than I used to be. I wonder if that could happen again. So in my work with people, I find that a core issue for a lot of people, although it takes a while to drill down to get to it, is the feeling a lot of people have of being trapped. They're trapped inside a persona that is no longer who they are. They're trapped in a marriage. They're trapped in a job. They're trapped in a lifestyle that really doesn't suit them anymore. It'd be like growing and having clothes that were too tight and now they don't fit.
Wearing your clothes from when you were 14.
Yeah. And so I think it's very heroic. And I certainly hope that our work supports listeners and readers who are on this same journey as we are from surviving to thriving. It's a bit like snakes shedding their skins.
Right.
They do that regularly, and I think we humans do that too.
Well, right. We just, like you say, we haven't created the context or the permission to do so. And it's, as you're discussing that, where, like you said, we each go through changes, and the concern where maybe I want to scurry back, as you said, to normal, For me, it's kind of the vision of putting my fingers in my ears, closing my eyes, and going la 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 la. Like I don't, I don't want to see, I don't want to hear the change. Pretending that it's not there. That ultimately, if I'm not dealing with it, is going to be producing anywhere from a low grade to a high grade anxiety. Right?
No kidding.
Because there's something there that I'm trying to not see, but I know it's there.
Yeah, and the huge breakthrough, and this really relates to leadership in the way we describe it, is to realize that our value relates to the way we're leading in our lives, and that'll apply to work, etc. But this is, I think, one of the deepest levels of leadership, is daring to keep growing personally once we become an adult.
Yeah.
It's acceptable when you're a baby, when you're a kid, because you can see the changes. The body grows, you're learning things, etc. But kind of the assumption is you become an adult at some point and you stop growing and learning. Well, that's just patently false. And yet our society doesn't actually support ongoing maturation once we reach adulthood.
Well, and you talked about the persona. Is the persona that I have created for myself. We've used the term the story, the identity that I've created myself. Is it still a fit?
Yeah.
Does it still enable me to be who I've grown into? Or I love your vision of that, or I'm going to be trying to run around in my 14-year-old clothes, that no longer fit. And that's the permission of that. That's worth a whole other episode.
Well, it is, and there's a function that kings provided and queens in days of yore to walk around their kingdom and just see all their subjects and kind of honor them. It wasn't about honoring the king and queen; it was about honoring the people. And if they did that, the kingdom would flourish. It was a tradition. I was at a meeting last night where I was emceeing, and at the end of it, I just looked around the room, and we had 50, 60 people there, and I just said, "Thank you for being here. It made a difference that you were here." And as I said that, I happened to catch the eyes of an elderly woman who just locked eyes with me and started to weep. And I could tell that in that moment I had validated something for her of her sense of self-worth.
Wow.
So I think that is our message, our core message with assessment, is that with all our rough edges, with all our problems, the mistakes we make, etc., if we dare to look at all that and then go, you know what, I'm okay. I'm a unique human being. I have a vision of contributing in my life and enjoying myself, having great relationships, and I dare to look at the way things are without getting depressed.
Wow. Well, we'd love to hear your thoughts and stories about assessment. Send them to us at thrivinginbusinessandlife@gmail.com. I'm Christopher Harding.
I'm Will Wilkinson. Thanks so much for being with us. Talk to you again next time.